Hello and welcome, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying this lovely cold day. We definitely got dumped snow here. But again, thank you for joining us today. We have a really special guest that's going to cover a bit of healthcare. Blows our mind what she can do. But before we do that, as a reminder, you have questions, chat. We'll go to those at the end. If you would like to ask a question out loud, we can also unmute you, but towards the end of the presentation. And as always, Dave, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Hey, thanks, everybody. We just thought it would be great. As you know, we like to bring in experts on lots of different things, whether it's Bitcoin, as we're all trying to understand what the heck that is and what the heck it means, and is it ever going to be anything. But we also wanted to talk, as we did a little bit ago, about energy and other things when we have actually access to great sources. And this is going to be diving into some things science-wise, health-wise, that are really astounding. And obviously, you've heard me say it before, there are so many different developments going on out there in biotech and genetics, artificial intelligence, robotics, all of those things. And we're trying to kind of be out in front of those, but it's very difficult. One of our clients sends me this article every week on 3D printing, just to kind of throw something else into the mix. And the developments are astounding. But how do we invest in those areas? What do we do? And what we have been doing is to put clients into exchange traded funds. We're not trying to guess which genetic company, if it's CRISPR or some other one, that is going to be the dominant force in that, or if there's 10 companies we haven't even heard of that are going to be knocking on the door of financial success. Many of these are so cutting edge, the companies just lose boatloads of money, but everybody knows that there are billions of dollars of profits to be had out there if you lead in robotics and genetics and things like that. So we are struggling right now with our guest is struggling with technology. So I'm going to run with this just for a little bit, and then we'll have some technical background into this as we hopefully get that fixed, okay? But what I wanted to make you aware too, as we're mixing portfolios, what we're kind of thinking about in regards to this is, do we want to get some money in front of things that are just screaming higher, that are really, if you will, sales are beginning to explode. It looks like technology is kind of leaning that direction, solving problems. And the answer is that's what we're trying to do, is to get some money in front of it, even if it's mostly an income account. You know, it's not just, these are growth investments, that's for sure. But one of the things that I learned in the late 1990s is that sometimes the only thing that works is growth. Sometimes the only thing working is value and dividends and things like that, which is going to be the core of any income portfolio. There's no question about that. Those will be the core pieces. But at the same time, what we learned in 1998 and 1999, that no matter how much you sold of those tech stocks that had no earnings, that were just air.com, and we sold those out of mutual funds and things like that, it just kept growing. That was the part that all the money went to. And so you also, if you will, you kind of evolve in any industry that you love, that you are passionate about, that you continue to work in and work as hard as we do. You kind of evolve things, and you don't just get stuck. I started on the value side, wouldn't even touch a company that was dealing in genetics or something like that didn't make money. Who would do that? That's absolutely crazy. But what happens is that you find that there are areas, whether we are picking the company or not, that it has an incredible future. Does anybody think that lithium batteries won't be important? I do, until something replaces them, they will. That the electric vehicles will be important, and they will. But we don't know how long it takes before these companies can be profitable. And so what we want to do is we just want to basically use these exchange traded funds, ETFs for short, some mutual funds, and their experts, and make that decision that way. So you may see a portfolio that is high growth, where we use a lot of this. And we're just talking about one or two areas, really. when you think about it. We've got the Internet of Things. Almost all of you, even income portfolios, have the Internet of Things, which we'll be speaking about a little bit today as well. Why? Because 5G and all the things that come with that, the connectivity. We're going to literally be wearing monitors inside, little sensors and all on our clothes to sense whether our diabetes is under control. We'll know if somebody's about to have a heart attack. These things really are coming, but they require 5G, 6G, and all those other things that I don't even really understand, but we do know we want to get money in front of. And that's the idea of using these exchange traded funds. So if it's something that kind of is mind bending, and I think it is, there's no question in my mind that these things are mind bending as how far we are on genetics and all these other things. How are they going to make money? Who is going to be the leader? And one of the examples I try to give of that and why we don't try to pick that, number one, we're not in that area. And even if we thought somebody was, we would never, ever think of this as a rifle approach. We want a shotgun approach in all of these areas. And I'll give you an example why. In the 1920s, we all, it became apparent that the automobile was going to be something else in our country. And it was. We kind of all know that. And so everybody's going to start up a car company. And there were literally hundreds or thousands of them, but there were certainly dozens and dozens trading publicly on the New York Stock Exchange. And even though, yes, it replaced the horse, almost all of them went out of business. I mean, almost all of them. And you had all the tailwinds. It's just very difficult to take and have a small company even survive to become a mid-sized company, to become a publicly listed company, to actually be profitable. It is an amazing sequence of events when you think about it. The odds are so stacked against it. And you think about computers. Who survived the advent of the computer, if you want to talk about something more modern, that is absolutely monstrous? It is a huge plus for the whole world. And in computing, anybody remember Commodore computers, right? Anybody remember, I think it was called collegiate computing.
They're like,
what's
what?
That? I know. They're all gone. They're all wiped out. And they were the first ones on the scene. And so we all get excited about those things. But the reality is, I don't want to get too excited about a company like CRISPR on genetics, okay? All that genetic technology is CRISPR, but does that mean they're going to be the ones that get it? Because it is open source. What does open source mean? Everybody is sharing the information as it's evolved, trying to figure out how to make it commercially successful. Wow, that's going to be something else. So, hey, before I go on any further, are we?
We're ready to go. She's ready to go, Dave. Yep,
okay,
doesn't have a
great.
camera, but she can share her screen and she's set to go when you're ready to turn it over.
All right, perfect,
Yes.
perfect. All right, we're not going to worry about the first name because it's pronounced Arelis. Okay, so Arelis Agosto, which I love that last name. That is such a great, prominent name. But Arelis, thank you so much for joining us. She is a global research analyst, or I should say, a healthcare analyst with Global X. And she's off to a conference right now, which is where we run into trouble with the technology. But coming fresh off of JP Morgan's healthcare seminar, and to give you an idea of how big that is, I believe there's something like 10,000 people show up at that. It is a monster event. Hundreds of companies are presenting their ideas. With that as a background, Arelis, please take it away, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. And thank you for bearing with me from a technological standpoint. Very excited to chat with all of you as to what's happening in the world of healthcare. By way of background, I help cover our healthcare suite of ETFs here at Global X. So anything genomics related, biotechnology related, telemedicine, digital health related. So a world of opportunity throughout, and a lot of topics that we'll be chatting through today. If we could move on, perfect. Just in terms of who Global X is, we are a global ETF provider with about 100 ETFs, 36 of which are thematic, really known for our thematic suite, but really just over $40 billion in AUM. When we think about, for example, If we can move on to the next slide, what we're going to be presenting today, we'll be chatting through Charting Disruption, which is our annual research project that spans not only healthcare, but different sectors across the market that we see opportunity in. And our team of analysts really works through expectations for the next decade or so in each of these. So not only personalized medicine, but greener economy, experiential technologies, fintech, blockchain, and Web3. So if you are interested in learning more, please visit us at globalxetfs.com. But by way of introduction, again, in terms of our research team, this is the team that worked through this piece, and we are available if you want to learn more, not only about healthcare. I'm always available, but if you want to learn more as to our other chapters or areas of expertise, we are available to you. For this piece, we also utilized a group of experts for the different sectors that we cover. So for example, for healthcare, we utilized Luba Greenwood, CEO of Cogent Therapeutics, Harvard professor, encouraging managing partner at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, really helping us out with expertise, not only in digital health, but also therapeutics and where she expects M&A to move in the next few years. So we'll be chatting a little bit about those. The first portion of our presentation that we'll be discussing here right now is genomic sequencing and diagnostics. Obviously, no surprise, the level of sort of growth and momentum the industry saw as a result of the pandemic. But when we think about still the unmet need in the industry, an estimated 350 million individuals with an undiagnosed disease, still a lot of work to do. And we'll be chatting through a few of the different categories as to work that's being done to address this, but also that present really interesting investment opportunities in healthcare. With that, just to provide some context as to genomics, genomics isn't necessarily a new term or a new sort of concept. The Human Genome Project began in 1990 with the goal of mapping the entirety of the human genome. That project actually concluded in 2003 with only 92% of the human genome being mapped. They really just lacked the technology to decipher that remaining 8%. And only in 2022, less really than a year ago, we were actually able to get 100% of the human genome, that remaining 8%, through the advent of new technology like long-read sequencing. Really simplistically, long-read sequencing is just a longer way to analyze the DNA. When going through a sequencer, it has to be broken up into different pieces. So the longer those pieces are, the greater, or rather, the greater opportunity for a more comprehensive view as to actual DNA. With that said, when we look at, for example, adoption so far in the market, and when we look at price versus adoption here, if we can move on to the next slide, we can see, for example, a graph showing cost per genome mapped out through time with the number of sequences performed every year. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of adoption we've seen so far in this regard has been from a research setting. That really encompasses, for example, biopharmaceutical companies, government organizations, and the like for either drug discovery, pathogen monitoring, etc. And again, a key criteria for adoption so far has been accuracy. You want to make sure that we have the most accurate opportunity to inform drug development, for example. Where this opportunity will now move towards is that clinical setting. When we, for example, poll attendees at these presentations that we do, people might not even be familiar that these tests are currently available at a patient level, or if they are familiar, they have not yet used it. And that's largely because it's not yet readily available to all patients across, not even the US, but the world. When we really look at this, this is where the opportunity will lie in the next decade or so. Again, from a patient perspective, key criteria for adoption here being price. When we look at the price per genome over time, starting at nearly $100 million in 2000, the average right now is about 600. This is really exciting as to not only being able to expand the appropriate patients that would be able to utilize this technology, but also the work behind the scenes from these firms to decrease that price further to $100 per genome. We believe that this will be really a key mark for the industry to hit in order to make it readily accessible. Latest figures show that only 0.07% of the world population has had their genome sequenced. When we reach really mass scale, this is where the opportunity will lie in genomics. So with that, when we look at the competitive landscape for the industry, We talked about briefly short read sequencing versus long read sequencing. On the short read front, major firm here being Illumina with an estimated 70% of market share in the space. Also players like Thermo Fisher and BGI more so an Asian player actually entering the US market later this year. And on the long read sequencing, companies like, for example, Oxford Nanopore and Pacific Biosciences, they're getting really narrow in terms of their accuracy and their approach to make this widely accessible across the world to answer biology's toughest questions, while short read sequencing will be used at scale, at least in the short term, at a client level or a patient level. And we're also seeing consolidation, and we think this will play a very important sort of aspect as to longer term adoption. When we look at Illumina, for example, they are coming out this year with a long read sequencer, and Pacific Biosciences, again, as you can see, more of a long read sequencer through recent acquisition coming out in 2023 with a short read sequencing platform. If we can move on to the next slide, when we look at, for example, again, genomics, not necessarily a new term. With that though, understanding the DNA simply isn't enough to get an accurate picture of biology. So with that, we're seeing increased innovation and increased adoption of, for example, transcriptomics and proteomics, the study of, for example, RNA and proteins respectively, to get a more comprehensive view as to what's actually causing illnesses and thus how we can find more accurate treatments or cures for these illnesses. And then finally, there's another portion of this, right? How does the environment or lifestyle choices impact a particular patient? All of these together are like pieces of a puzzle coming together to answer, again, who has a predisposition to a particular illness and how can we address that even before symptoms are present in a patient. If we can move forward, all of this information is really exciting in theory, but how do we implement this at a patient level? And how are we seeing the opportunity evolve, not just from a sequencing standpoint, but from different indications or groups of illnesses? When we think about cancer, for example, again, unsurprisingly, survival rates plotted against the stage at which a patient is currently in drop precipitously. And unfortunately, far too late, these cancer cases are diagnosed in stage 4, stage 3. As you can see there, 57% of lung cancer cases are diagnosed at stage 3. 53% of pancreatic cancer cases are diagnosed at stage 4. So any improvement in that regard is really a benefit, not only economically, but also to the patient level. And with that said, the newer technologies that we just discussed, like genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, are being utilized in a new way through simple blood-based tests. These are called liquid biopsies, so as opposed to an invasive, quite costly option like a tissue biopsy. These look for certain biomarkers or clues in the blood that tell us that there's potential presence of cancer. These have widespread potential. So in an ideal world, patients would go to their annual checkup, get a regular blood test for a host of different sort of tests to be run, this being one of them. So it sort of adds a level of screening that isn't currently widespread, isn't sort of available to the masses. It can also be available to inform next steps for suspected cancer patients. It can be utilized as therapy guidance, so understanding what mutations might be primarily driving the cancer presence in a patient and thus guiding us to what therapy will be most appropriate. Also, minimal residual disease. Is our intervention, is our therapy actually working? Are we seeing a decrease in cancer levels in the blood? And finally, recurrence monitoring. If you look at the figures, currently 85% of relapses are caught too late. So if we have a readily available blood-based option, like for example, the biopsy, that has significant potential for cancer patients. We're also seeing sort of tangential verticals, like for example, hereditary cancer. These are understanding genetic predispositions for a patient that can inform, for example, more frequent screening methods for that patient. And finally, real world data. These are essentially putting all of the data that these companies gather through these tests to help pharmaceutical companies prioritize development of medications. And with that, for example, when looking at the broader competitive landscape, you can tell we believe that we're going to continue to see consolidation across each of the verticals that we just highlighted. and that industry players that will disproportionately win out are those that have a presence of each of these. And we're already seeing this materialize. For context, any box with orange text is a test currently in development, and we're going to continue to see innovation across the board from these really exciting players like Caris Life Sciences, Exact Sciences, Illumina, etc. And with that, when looking at the broader sequencing and diagnostics market, particularly plotting it against the adoption curve, we can see genomic sequencing, really when we see it at the moment, I put the figure of 0.07% of individuals having had their genome sequenced. The market is estimated to be $120 billion by 2030. And at the moment, only currently 7% penetrated. So a lot of opportunity here for these industry firms to benefit. And then in our belief, genomic sequencing will play a key role in opening the door to other types of tests or options for patients like liquid biopsy. Liquid biopsy is just one of these examples, and as you can see in the adoption curve quite early on. With all of that said, we can move into therapeutics, and this feeds in perfectly. We just chatted through what information is genomic sequencing telling us about patients and what drives illnesses. So now how do we put all of that information into developing highly effective medications for patients? When we, for example, plot out FDA approvals and the number of clinical trials worldwide, you can see the number of clinical trials has really increased quite steadily over the last few years. And when we see, for example, FDA approvals over time, some sort of factors to discuss here, particularly the proportion of the bar chart that's in navy blue compared to orange. Navy blue are called small molecule drugs. These are usually chemical-based drugs versus biologics or large molecule drugs being derived through viruses or human derived samples and the like. We're seeing a greater proportion of approvals lately be from this biologic segment. We're really encouraged by what this means. These usually have higher efficacy, for example, and they really point us towards we're seeing more efficient therapies already. That clinical trial number to us is a leading indicator for further approvals worldwide. So we're very excited. When we think about the opportunities across different therapies or illnesses, unfortunately, far too often these are considered or relied on symptomatic therapy. I usually give the example of Alzheimer's. Far too often, unfortunately, patients are given mood boosters. These really don't help to halt or much less revert disease progression or dementia in Alzheimer's patients. So we're moving towards an area where we have much more effective medications to manage illnesses, but also when we consider, for example, finding the patients that have a predisposition and addressing the root cause of that before the patient is actually symptomatic. We're very excited about what this will mean. When looking at these illnesses in terms of risk versus reward, we ran this sort of model as to understand perhaps what opportunities lie moving forward. For context, the size of the bubble correlates to expected 2028 sales for each of these categories. I will point you to the outlier. The highest risk, highest reward illness in our study was Alzheimer's, and there's a few reasons why. When we look at, for example, Alzheimer's, it is quite a heterogeneous illness. When we look at, for example, patients that present with Alzheimer's, they can have a host of different manifestations or presentations of the illness. And for example, around 70% of dementia patients are believed to have Alzheimer's. Largely because of this number, we were asking ourselves, why is this? And when we look at it, Alzheimer's is a disease of exclusion, meaning there's nothing in particular that can say this patient has Alzheimer's, but rather this patient has dementia. And we weren't really able to identify any specific illness that the patient has. So we're thus largely saying it's Alzheimer's. This makes drug development that much harder. And when we plot out, for example, deaths in the US by 1,000 individuals, quite increasing or worryingly worsening. So 131% increase in deaths per 1,000 individuals in the last 20 years in the US compared to, for example, HIV. Or heart disease or cancer, those are decreasing in the same time frame, or diabetes increasing at a much slower rate. With that, when we look at new drugs in development in Alzheimer's, really exciting number of investigational therapies, 143 investigational therapies and really not just looking at management of the symptoms, but really how do we modify this disease? In other words, are we getting to the root cause of the illness, and how do we address that? When we look at the market, unsurprisingly, very exciting potential growth in terms of sales of therapies, 50% compound annual growth rate expected through 2028. And really, when we look at the top expected drugs in that time frame, all of them, or the vast majority of them, being disease modifying. This is really the shift that we expect to see across the board, not just for Alzheimer's, but again, really exciting developments at a patient level, and that presents a really interesting investment opportunity. With that, let's move towards precision medicine, particularly precision oncology. When we think about, for example, the way that patients are treated at a high level, a few years ago or a few decades ago, even sometimes still now, patients that have cancer are far too often treated the same. Not just what type of cancer do you have, not just what mutation is primarily driving your cancer, but rather everyone is prescribed to, for example, chemotherapy. Chemotherapy in this instance is only really effective in about 30% of cases, versus compared to targeted therapy, successful in 80% of cases. This really presents a really exciting opportunity, again, across the board. But when we think about this, still quite early days. Only 8% of cancer patients have an FDA-approved treatment that match their unique needs. Not even to say the opportunity that lies for neurological diseases, immunology, and the like. If we can move on to the next slide, we can see, for example, that the tests that rely or are able to tell us what particular therapy a patient is the best match for, we see these tests improving quite steadily in terms of approvals. But on the right-hand side, you can tell it's quite concentrated in terms of which particular mutations are currently available, both from a therapeutic standpoint or from even a test to tell us if the patient has a particular presence of a mutation. With that, those are a lot of acronyms, right? So what do those acronyms mean? We looked into HER2 and KRAS. These are two particular mutations that have been quite popular of late. Essentially, these are both key functions in regular cell growth, but when mutated, can help spread cancer quite quickly. Just for HER2, for example, 15 to 20% of breast cancer cases are primarily driven for HER2. For gastric cancers, that figure is 10 to 30%. KRAS, for example, responsible for 95% of pancreatic cancers, 30 to 40% of colon cancers. And when we look at the therapies that correspond to these mutations, we're seeing those perform quite well. We can see, for example, Daiichi Sankyo and AstraZeneca's Enhertu in terms of expected sales through 2028, with a compound annual growth rate of about 38%. A lot of opportunity here, right, for patients, but also we're seeing this go beyond that. HER2 is, for example, sort of leading the pack as to different mutations and how we think about not only primarily driving the cancer, but also playing a smaller role and seeing really high efficacy data. When we look at the cancer space more broadly, and when we look at sort of obviously quite a extensive market for patients and of course for medications, these sort of medications, particularly in terms of the top 10 oncology drugs through 2028, all of them biomarker driven and expected to account for 28.3% of sales for the $367 billion oncology sector. And you can see that'll play a significant role across the board at the moment, with more opportunity for those different mutations that are currently being worked on at a drug development level. We chatted, of course, about the opportunity for specific indications or illnesses, but what technologies, for example, are being utilized to address these? We ran a similar risk versus reward analysis for different technologies like gene editing, cell therapy, gene therapy, DNA and RNA therapy, et cetera. And what we see is that there's a lot of opportunity here. These, for example, utilize different methods to potentially cure patients of their illnesses. And we're really excited about what this will entail moving forward. I'll flag, for example, gene editing, the lowest risk, highest return technology in our category. And they actually are expected to have the first FDA analysis or evaluation of a gene editing therapy in 2023, that being from CRISPR Therapeutics and Vertex Pharmaceuticals. So very exciting developments here across the board. If we think about, for example, what this means of having curative treatments for for these illnesses, it really is shaping the way we think about healthcare. And one of the figures that usually comes out as a question for clients, and that we usually get quite often, is these come with really high price tags. Why is that? Is it justified? How will that trend? So we ran a scenario for sickle cell disease. I mentioned, for example, the first gene editing therapy to be evaluated by the FDA that is actually for sickle cell disease. And that therapy is expected to come to market at $2 million per patient. There's also a gene therapy that is already approved in the United States for sickle cell disease, came to market at about $2.8 million per patient. Again, reminding you that these are functional cures of these illnesses. So how do we sort of compare that to the burden that patients sort of experience as a result of having sickle cell? Americans with sickle cell disease pay an average of $44,000 in out-of-pocket costs. Insurers pay an average of $1.7 million per sickle cell disease patient in their lifetime. And when we think, for example, of inability to work and sort of lost wages as a result of that, about $700,000 per patient in their lifetime. When you plot that out against sort of the prices that we're already seeing in the market, they seem a little bit less crazy, right, if we're thinking about functional cures. But we're very encouraged by the work currently being done on the back end to ensure that infrastructure is set up to decrease these costs even further and make them available to a wider range of patients. I mentioned earlier that we worked with a few experts for charting disruption and how we think about the markets moving forward or these sectors moving forward. We worked, as I mentioned, with the amazing Luba Greenwood, really looking into innovation in the pharmaceutical space, driven both by smaller biotechnology firms and then larger pharmaceutical firms. So when we think about it, again, unsurprisingly, we see that biotech really plays a key role in driving industry innovation, where large pharmaceutical companies really offer focused scale funds. These really work together to ensure that the space is moving quite quickly, driving innovation constantly. And you can see just in terms of share of phase one assets by company size in 2021, 72% of those were from emerging biopharma companies. So very encouraging. When we look at, for example, the sort of pace so far that we've seen for M&A activity, or rather business development activity over time, you can see on the next slide that, for example, we've seen sort of business development activity really sort of grow in the last couple of years. Apologies, if we can move on to the next slide, we'll be able to see the volume of business development activity, particularly when looking at licensing activity, R&D collaborations, corporate acquisitions, product acquisitions, and mega mergers. We saw a really strong boom of these in 2020 and 2021. Slower year in 2022. For context, this data is up to April of 2022, but sneak peek, it still sort of fell below what we saw in its previous 2 years. And there's a few reasons why, largely as a result of sort of the broader macroeconomic environment. There was less of a focus in terms of business development activity, but we're very encouraged by what we expect in terms of, for example, corporate and product acquisitions. We expect licensing to play a key role moving forward. And when we think about, for example, the need from a pharmaceutical company to acquire in the short term, when looking at R&D spend plotted against expected growth for sales over the next few years, you can see, for example, that companies sort of land in different ways in terms of their spend for business development and M&A and the like, and then expected growth sales. This shows us the differing levels of need to acquire in the short term, and thus what should inform business development activity moving forward. And then finally, our expert in our very last slide in this category here, one further actually, she helped us sort of plot out expectations for appetite for acquisitions of biotechnology companies by therapeutic categories. So she expects less focus in oncology, just given sort of the broader growth that we've already seen in this market. For example, more interest in immunology and autoimmune disorders. And finally, she also chatted through sort of deal size and what she expects to be quite popular. She expects acquisition sizes to continue to decrease to a certain extent, given valuation depreciation and greater risk aversion. She also expects sort of lower upfront payments and earlier stage firms to be more popular comparatively. So that brings us to our conclusion of the therapeutics portion. And when we map out again in terms of adoption, the different sort of technologies or categories that we chatted through today, we're very encouraged by what these next generation medications really will present themselves to be moving forward. And these are expected to comprise 18% of the $1.35 trillion pharmaceutical market in 2030, up from only 3% of the $856 billion market in 2022. So highly encouraging data and sort of updates from pharmaceutical companies across the board here. This leads us to our last sort of chapter for today, that being telemedicine and digital health. We chatted, of course, through the back end of how we analyze the human genome, how that feeds into pharmaceutical development. And really this category of telemedicine and digital health speaks to care of patients and utilizing technology to really sort of improve patient care across the board and decrease prices. When we look at this in particular, we categorize this in terms of 5 key buckets. Health app, so these are applications to monitor, detect, and analyze physical health conditions. Sensors, so thinking of wearable technology. Telemedicine, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, became very sort of a key topic of conversation during COVID-19, particularly because it was so customer facing. 4th being online pharmacies, and finally AI in healthcare. When we plot these out in terms of the market size, highly encouraging overall growth with an expected 18% compound annual growth rate. But even just looking at each of these, you can see, for example, how AI has an expected 37% compound annual growth rate in that same time frame. So very encouraged here throughout. We'll chat through each of these, but to first start with wearable sensors, we're very encouraged by what we've seen so far. And when we look at, for example, the breadth of devices in the market, we're seeing more and more of those, but we're also gathering more and more information from them. So whether it be blood pressure, cough frequency, glucose levels, mobility, pollution levels, sleep quality, etc. Really, we're seeing more and more information play a role with these wearables already in the market. And they have a few benefits, as you could probably imagine. But when we look at, for example, diabetes, we use this sort of as a proof of concept for the space because it is comparatively the most mature subsegment of wearable technology. For just the measuring of glucose, patients largely relied on blood glucose levels. So this requires a lancet, essentially a finger prick. You drop a sort of drop of blood into the sensor and it tells you your glucose levels. Understandably, these can only really be done 4 to 10 times a day, giving us only a snapshot view of where glucose levels are. They don't give us information as to how glucose levels are trending or when, for example, they're reaching sort of a speed at which they're decreasing or increasing that we should worry about. We now have, for example, continuous glucose monitors. These are sensors that are inserted under the skin, measure glucose multiple times a day, up to 288 times a day, and they transfer the data automatically to a patient's phone. These are also able to automatically share that data with loved ones or even physicians, and can alert, for example, 911 if the levels have increased or decreased far to above or below target levels. This also leads us to automatic insulin delivery. Patients at the moment largely rely on insulin injections. They have to interpret the data of glucose levels and decide when it's best to intervene through insulin delivery. We're now seeing automatic insulin pumps. These essentially automatically connect to your continuous glucose monitor and are able to detect when insulin levels should be adjusted. It does this automatically, removing all guesswork. And again, just for context, as to, for example, just continuous glucose monitors, recent studies show that they have decreased patient hospitalization by 67%. Really encouraging here. And again, we see, a lot of opportunity for not only diabetes, but this to be replicated in other categories, for example, like cardiac illnesses, neurological illnesses, and the like. We also, for example, chatted about artificial intelligence. It poses one of the higher growth areas in digital health more broadly. And we're seeing the different data sources, like, for example, clinical trial information, prescription data, insurance claims, what we just talked about, wearable technology, etc. They're all being fed into AI, and AI is giving us sort of newer ways to interpret medical data and giving us actionable steps as a result. Just to give you a few examples, medical imaging interpretation has been a big one, feeding into surgical robots, anticipating medication efficiency, patient triage to prioritize care of patients at a hospital where, for example, there aren't enough doctors to treat everyone at the same time. I'm really encouraged by sort of the opportunity for AI. And even a step further, when we think about AI and wearable sensors together, just plotting out cumulative number of artificial intelligence and machine learning enabled medical devices being approved at an FDA level, you can see that the number has sort of increased quite steeply in the last few years. And with that, we're also seeing, for example, devices from Google Life Sciences receiving FDA approval for example, watches to measure irregular pulse monitors, etc. I'm very encouraged by what this will mean, and we'll see these two categories in particular play a big role together in terms of increasing adoption and improving medical outcomes. To speak to telemedicine, and again, I mentioned this is the most consumer-facing category in the digital health space. We see, for example, telemedicine as a percentage of total medical claims in the US. You see that spike at the beginning of 2020 as a result of COVID-19. But what we've seen is that number, since we saw the initial volatility, has stabilized, really giving us sort of an expected stickiness with customers as to their desire to utilize telemedicine. When we see, for example, the benefits of this technology, we see that, for example, patients who utilize telemedicine have 19% fewer visits to the ER or urgent care. The average cost of a virtual specialist visit is $120 less than average. And this data continues to pour in as to the benefits of telemedicine. Once we think about sort of the broader opportunity, not only in telemedicine, we can see that, for example, AI drug discovery. So we're utilizing the toolkit that we just discussed, each of the different factors that play a role in digital health. AI and drug discovery is a really exciting space that we're very sort of encouraged to see the level of innovation that's currently happening here. This is a $50 billion market that's really working towards faster and cheaper development of treatments. It's really expanding the repertoire or the availability to develop highly effective medications like the one we chatted about in our previous section. But really at the moment, it's offering 20 to 40% reduction in costs for preclinical development of biotechnology drugs. This is a big deal. I'll also quickly highlight new clinical endpoints when we think about how, for example, the industry uses sort of a rubric to measure if a medication is actually working and thus should receive FDA approval or approval in the rest of the world. A lot of the times, we don't necessarily have a very clear sort of rubric. We're using, for example, surrogate endpoints. So wearable technology and artificial intelligence are helping us gather much more accurate data as to if medications are actually working and thus deserve to be commercially available. With that, we sort of map out the space, perhaps by use case, those being primary care, chronic care management, and mental health. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the adoption so far in telemedicine has been in mental health. It is something that can be quite readily utilized in its current stage, but we're very encouraged by what telemedicine, wearable technology, and beyond will mean for example, chronic care management. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid in the US, for example, they report that 93% of overall Medicare spending comes from 2/3 of Medicare beneficiaries with multiple chronic care conditions. Really, any sort of improvement in this regard will mean a lot at an economic level and also for patients. And finally, primary care. We're seeing more and more interest in adoption of primary care from telemedicine, from wearable technology, and AI. When we look at, for example, the role that large technology companies play, we're very encouraged by increasing conversion between healthcare and large tech. And we think this will play a key role in adoption. Some users, for example, might be hesitant to utilize wearable technology or direct to consumer pharmacies delivering your medications at home. But what we're seeing is, for example, Amazon, through their acquisition of PillPack, and since then, a lot of work on the back end to offer pharmacy delivery to all Amazon Prime patients. Amazon Prime has an estimated 200 million individuals with Prime accounts. This is automatically offering this technology or this service to patients around the world and really making them much more comfortable with this. In terms of, for example, Apple really concentrating more on the device side. Again, when we think about approvals, for example, of an Apple Watch, we can see that more and more features are being automatically included in updates for the Apple Watch, whether it be AFib, monitoring for example, falls. This will play, again, this is instantly putting these sort of services into a patient's literal hand. This will play a big role in adoption. This will play a big role in acceptance for this technology and encourage growth across the industry. And speaking of Apple, when we, for example, plot out sort of a news flow for Apple in the healthcare and biometric sector, we can remember, right, earlier in this sort of century, we saw a lot of their work being in biometric data through, for example, fingerprint testing or face recognition for security purposes. Now they're moving towards an area of not only expanding their opportunities through their Apple Watch, but looking at opportunities beyond that. Currently, the AirPods are being investigated for example, measuring of teeth grinding or temperature monitoring, analyzing, for example, sleep patterns. This we find very encouraging and will play, again, a really key role in the broader adoption of telemedicine and digital health. When plotting it against that same adoption S-curve, you can see that continuous glucose monitors, as a reminder, just a portion of wearable technology, are farther ahead and sort of paving the way for wearable technology to become more and more accepted. We also see, for example, telemedicine, insulin pumps, wearable technologies, but again, earliest in its terms of adoption is AI in healthcare. For context, the digital health industry is expected to reach $182 billion by 2027, and this really represents an 18% CAGR. So that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I'm sure I threw a lot at you at the moment, but if you want more information, please feel free to sort of visit us at chartingdisruption.com. You can see our full sort of lineup of analysis in different sectors. And then finally, if you have any questions that would like to chat about to us, please, again, I reiterate, don't hesitate to sort of reach out. We're more than happy to walk through any of the different areas that we cover.
So Dave, before you jump in, I just wanted everyone to know the Charting Disruption site is in the chat feature, so you can just copy that. It is informational only. There's no funds listed. It's just to look at interviews and have some more information that Liz has already shared with you, but you can go in and watch a little bit more of it if you're interested.
Good. Hey, yeah, let's just start off, and then Jen, you can check our chats and see if we have some others. But
yep,
let's start off some Q&A here. Let's not keep it. We'll go and try to answer any questions you have. But I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time. I noticed a lot of references in there to big pharma, and that makes sense since they have so much money. But this is really moving in a different area. So are these companies, big pharma, are they actually developing some of their new therapies, or are they buying out other folks in this particular space?
Absolutely. It's a great question, and the answer to it is both. They're both developing things internally and relying on expertise from a biotech level. If we think about example, gene editing, cell and gene therapy, these are areas that smaller biotech firms have a lot of expertise on that they can bring to a large pharma company. These are areas where, for example, it might make more sense to acquire. But when we think about, for example, commercial implications, submitting these newer categories for FDA approval, even manufacturing, small biotech, again, in these particular newer categories, sort of require the expertise from pharma. That's why we see a lot of partnerships, which is what we've seen, for example, from Vertex Pharmaceuticals, more so partnering with companies rather than acquiring at the moment. But it'll be a combination of both moving forward, and that'll play a key role in making sure that the space develops as it should or at the speed that we expect it to.
Great. One of the things I found interesting that the cost of getting our genes, checked out, whatever, mapped. What has collapsed to below $1,000. I think you said $600 now. And obviously it's on its way very quickly down to much lower numbers. Why have only 1 million people chosen to do this? Is there a backlog of it? Number one, who is getting their genes checked? Why? And what would I gain from it by saying, fine, I don't care if insurance covers it. Here's $600. I want to know what I'm going to die from. What I ought to try to, improve in my life, other than the obvious things. Those kind of questions. I wonder if you could kind of dive into that. Why don't we all just get a check?
Absolutely. And the answer to this is that all of us should be getting our genome checked. At the moment, the supply is simply not there. To very quickly sort of describe how sequencing companies make money. They sell instruments to laboratories, and they also gain, for example, consumable revenue, and depending on how frequently, for example, the machine is run. At the moment, there's simply just not enough instruments placed. And what we're seeing is that throughput is a key sort of criteria for purchasing decisions as of late in the space. So we need to make sure that we're not only able to sequence or run one strand of DNA at a time, we can run multiple. And instead of taking us 24 hours, it takes us 2 hours. How many can one instrument actually handle? And then secondly, how do we ensure that we're increasing the number of instruments that are placed? As I mentioned, unfortunately, a lot of the placements that we've seen so far have been in the most innovative medical institutions. So when we think about Dana-Farber or Mount Sinai, it's very common to see those there, but at a patient level, they're not necessarily super available. Who's taking these, or what do you have to gain from these? I'll speak candidly, I have taken one of these tests. I really enjoyed it. And they essentially pinpoint, hey, you might have a predisposition to this or to this illness or not. If you do, let's map out sort of a path to making sure that we're monitoring you more often, since this patient might be at a higher risk. There's a lot to be gained, right? At the moment, for example, and again, this is largely as a result of not enough people having taken this test so far. A common sort of point for people that have gone through this test is they have a variance of unknown significance. This is essentially telling us, hey, something popped up in your genetic sequence. We don't actually know what it means. We don't have enough data to know if it is a predisposition to an illness or just a blip, or what it means. Essentially, they put you in a data set, and when and if that information is finally uncovered, they'll contact you and say, hey, this is actually what it means. No worries, nothing to worry about. Or this might represent a higher likelihood of this patient having a particular illness. Let's make sure you're going into screening more often. So there's a lot to be gained from this technology. But again, a lot of adoption on the back end needs to be figured out or worked out in order to patients, whenever they go to their physician, this is something that every patient is told about and ultimately has the ability to partake in.
Good. Let's swing over and let somebody else ask a question. I could go all day with these, so let's let somebody else chime in. Jen, what do we have?
We only have one so far. It's how does patient privacy and cybersecurity factor into all of this?
Another great question. When we think about more and more patient data being incorporated into the web or being tracked by a sensor, this is obviously of great concern and is a key priority for the healthcare space. We're seeing more and more funds being invested in cybersecurity. And we know that, for example, the FDA has a really strong or high bar as to approval for wearable technology, ensuring that safeguards are in place to ensure privacy of patient data. We also, for example, as a part of Charting Disruption, have information on cybersecurity. So I invite you to take a look, but really it plays a key role to answer the question, and will continue to play out, particularly as we see increased adoption or increased even consolidation amongst all of the industry firms.
Good.
That's all we have, Dave. So
That's terrific. Well, we're just about out of time anyway, so that'll be good. I guess I should probably wrap it this way to say, even if you're in an income portfolio, as I started with, this is an area that we need to get money in front of. I've spent the last few years, obviously many years now, thinking about, how do you design portfolios? How do we think about building portfolios? And one of the things that I keep coming back to is okay, we can't go beat the market. We've all heard that. So just invest and leave it in there. You've heard me talk about a cup of coffee a day and all that stuff. It's all 100% true. But one of the things that I also think about is what to avoid. And as we're talking about cutting edge things, we don't want to go too far out in front of our skis. And that's what's so amazing now, that we can take shotgun approaches at so many growth industries. But we also want to be steering away from, and maybe, if you will, how can I outperform the market? Maybe I can actually outperform it and take less risk by buying what? Things that don't do well. Automobile manufacturers, things like that. Airlines, they may stay in business, but they keep failing and doing it again. And I'm not sure I want to be in that kind of business. What I do know is I don't know when, but I do know genetics are going to be an incredible path to a healthier future for us. I know the cost curve in medicine is going to be bent. I know it is. These are things we know. We don't know when, but we do know telemedicine is working. It is a big part of overall medicine, particularly in rural areas now. And so people are getting better care. We're going to be bending the cost curve. We need to be out in front of those things. And so this combination of not chasing out too far out on our skis, but understanding where things are going technology-wise, that is, to me, one of the things that we've been changing over the past few years, and not kind of sticking to some of the, if you will, I don't want to call them dinosaurs, but really industries that aren't really growing very well. So with that, I think we better let everybody go. And I just want to say, Lise, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. I'm glad we got everything fixed. Thanks to Global X for providing the analysis for us. And everybody, let us know your feedback. We always want to hear that. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Absolutely, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.